So we're in our Daniel series. We're at Daniel chapter 5. But just like we started with a little quiz question, I wanted to start with a few little quiz questions for you, because we know how much people like quizzes, don't we? This passage this week, there's a really famous saying that comes from the Bible that we use to describe things. And so I wanted to start with just a few quiz questions to ask, does this phrase come from the Bible? Okay, do you get it? We'll start the first one, see what you think. First one up there. A leopard can't change his spots. Is it from the Bible or is it not from the Bible? Ten Commandments. We've got the elder on the front row giving us absolutely no help. Shakespeare? What do you think? Are you looking it up on your phone there? No? It is from the Bible. This is in Jeremiah 13, verse 23. It's where it comes from. It's God speaking about his people and their sinful nature, actually, and how in and of themselves they can't change their nature. Number 2. God works in mysterious ways. What do you think? Is it in the Bible? No one wants to commit on this one, do they?
No, I'm going to go no. It's not.
It's a no. His ways, yeah, there's lots of similar things. He wants to reveal mysteries. His ways are higher than our ways, but actually God works in mysterious ways is not one from the Bible. Number 3. Escaping by the skin of your teeth. We could talk about England in this way. If you don't know what this phrase means, we won by the skin of our teeth almost in every round. What do you think? From the Bible or not? Give me a hands up. I'm gonna get people to commit here. No one sort of hands up if you think this is from the Bible. Only a select few. Hands up if you think it's not from the Bible. Again, only a select few. This is from the Bible. This is Job speaking in Job chapter 19. If anybody didn't escape by the skin of their teeth, it was probably Job, but actually he talks about escaping. He was escaping death by the skin of his teeth. I didn't look at what it means. We know what that phrase means, though. I'll let you do an exegesis next week, Matt, on it. Next one. A drop in the bucket. From the Bible or not? You don't think they had buckets?
Buckets are modern invention.
This is an idiom. It is from the Bible. It's Isaiah chapter 14. And it's Isaiah speaking, say, the nations are like a drop in the bucket. They are considered as a speck of dust. And finally, the writing is on the wall. We might have talked about this when the exit poll came out. Yeah, literally, the writing was on the wall this week for Rishi Sunak. His time was up. Okay? And yes, this is in the Bible. This is in Daniel chapter 5. Okay, so we're going to look at this chapter now. I hope you're all getting an idea of what this series is all about. Essentially, we live 90% of our lives. It happens outside of church meetings. And we're specifically looking, aren't we, at what we can learn from Daniel and his friends when it comes to being in the world, but not allowing ourselves to be conformed to the world's culture. And interestingly, Daniel, as we've seen throughout these chapters, he wasn't only able to live in a godless culture, he was able to influence and shape the culture to look to Yahweh. And last week, Chris was looking at chapter 4, which was all about the humbling of Nebuchadnezzar, the king. And the very last verse of chapter 4 says this. It says, I haven't written it down in there. It's not in there. Is it on there? Can you put the next one on? Yeah. No, it's not in there. Daniel chapter 4, last verse. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and exalt and glorify the King of heaven, because everything he does is right, and all his ways are just, and those who walk in pride, he is able to humble. Okay? That's the last verse there. And here in chapter 5, we're not totally sure historically what sort of time has passed, but most historians would agree there's a sort of 20 to 30 year period between the end of chapter 4 and as we move into chapter 5. So it's just really important to note that, timescale-wise, there's a 20 to 30 year gap. Nebuchadnezzar is now dead, and there are now two rulers in place. There's Nabonidus and his son Belshazzar, okay? Just to say, we don't think either of these two kings are blood relatives of Nebuchadnezzar, even though they're referred to in the passage as son of Nebuchadnezzar. We think this term is actually used regarding roles, okay? So they refer to a grandfather or a father as someone who's been in the role of the king themselves. But back to this passage of chapter 5, which is all about this king Belshazzar, and he is throwing an elaborate party with 1,000 guests, okay? It's full of nobles, it's full of his wives and his concubines, all in the same room, which is a bit interesting. And he asks that the goblets from the temple of Jerusalem, which Nebuchadnezzar obviously went and ransacked, they be brought in so they can drink from them. And as they're drinking from these goblets, we're told that they are worshipping other gods, the gods of silver and gold and bronze and wood and stone. Interestingly, if you remember chapter 2, these are all things that are mentioned around this sculpture that is made that we're told is going to topple, and a new kingdom that will never be destroyed will rise up against this. And then the king sees what appears to be a physical hand writing on the wall. And it totally freaks the king out, okay? I think it would freak all of us out, to be fair, if we saw such a thing. And we're not sure if it's only the king that can see this or whether it's everybody in the room, but actually everyone can see the writing, so I'm presuming everyone can see this hand. But he calls again, this happens all the time as we see through the chapters of Daniel, the king calls his astrologers and his enchanters and his wise men, and he declares whoever can interpret this writing, he says, will be clothed in purple, will get some gold or a gold chain around their neck, and they will become the third highest ruler in the kingdom. Now, none of these wise men in the room who were brought into the room could interpret the writing, which freaks the king out even more. But then we have the queen who appears on the scene. She enters the room. Don't think this is his wife, to be honest. This is probably the old queen who was either married to Nebuchadnezzar or maybe to Nebuchadnezzar's son. And she tells Balthazar that there is someone in the kingdom of Babylon who can interpret. And it's just important to remember, again, this is 20 to 30 years have passed. And she says this of Daniel. She says, he was found to have a keen mind and knowledge and understanding, and also the ability to interpret dreams, explain riddles, and solve difficult problems. Call for Daniel, and he will tell you what the writing means. And so Daniel gets brought before the king, and he's offered the same deal. He's offered the purple robe, the gold chain, and the third highest ruler in the kingdom. And we're just going to pick up the passage from here. It's verse 17, if you've got your Bibles. And we're going to start as Daniel comes into this chapter. So Daniel answered the king, you may keep your gifts for yourself and give your rewards to someone else. Nevertheless, I will read the writing for the king and tell him what it means. Your Majesty, the Most High God gave your father Nebuchadnezzar sovereignty and greatness and glory and splendor. Because of the high position he gave him, all the nations and peoples of every language dreaded and feared him. Those the king wanted to put to death, he put to death. Those he wanted to spare, he spared. Those he wanted to promote, he promoted. And those he wanted to humble, he humbled. But when his heart became arrogant and hardened with pride, he was deposed from his royal throne and stripped of his glory. He was driven away from people and given the mind of an animal. He lived with the wild donkeys and ate grass like the ox, and his body was drenched with the dew of heaven, until he acknowledged that the Most High God is sovereign over all kingdoms on earth and sets over them anyone he wishes. But you, Belshazzar, his son, have not humbled yourself, though you knew all this. Instead, you have set yourself up against the Lord of heaven. You had the goblets from his temple brought before you, and you and your nobles, your wives and your concubines drank wine from them. You praised the gods of silver and gold, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone, which cannot see or hear or understand. But you did not honor the God who holds in his hand your life and all your ways. Therefore, he sent the hand that wrote the inscription. This is the inscription that was written. Mene, mene, tekel parson. And here is what these words mean. Mene, God has numbered the days of your reign and brought it to an end. Tekel, you have been weighed on the scales and found wanting. And Perez, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. Then, at Belshazzar's command, Daniel was clothed in purple, a gold chain was placed around his neck, and he was proclaimed the third highest ruler in the kingdom. That very night, Belshazzar, king of the Babylonians, was slain, and Darius the Mede took over the kingdom at the age of 62. So I just want to bring out a few points on this. We're obviously specifically really looking at Daniel and what we can learn in the week to week. And my first point is that Daniel was ready to be used by God, even though he'd been forgotten by man. Okay? What we know so far is Daniel had managed, if you remember, he'd managed to interpret a dream of the kings in chapter 2. But more than that, he'd been able to retell the king what his dream actually was. And I was thinking about this. I thought, man, the pressure. How would you feel if you were there having to interpret, what did the king dream? It must have felt intense. It must have felt immense. Going away and trusting God is going to reveal the king's dream to you. But I want to say he was obviously a man who spent so much time with God that his faith in what he could do through God was immense. The gifts God had given to Daniel were not squandered. They weren't put down. He didn't retire them at any point. But what we hear right now in chapter 5 is that Daniel has gone from being the king's right-hand man, the leader of the wise men in Babylon, to being a nobody. In 20 to 30 years, that's what's happened. He's nowhere to be seen in this group of 1,000 elites at the king's party. And it's not just the current king who's reigning who doesn't know Daniel. The whole room falls silent as the current wise men and magicians couldn't read this writing. None of them piped up and went, do you know what? There's a guy here. Apart from one person, it was the queen who heard what was going on, and she enters the room and she speaks up for Daniel. She'd already seen what he could do. She still remembered the power and the supernatural gifts that Daniel had already proved that he had. But I want to say it's not easy when we get forgotten, when we get looked over, when we feel undervalued. After being raised up for Daniel with such prominence to then just being dropped, this must have been difficult. I remember for me, one of the most challenging periods, honestly, in my life was after having chemo, which was like 15 years ago. And it was quite intense chemo. I was in hospital for 3 weeks, and they'd already told me that the recovery was going to be a long, difficult recovery. And I didn't quite grasp what they were talking about at that point. But I came home, and for the next 3 months, I was in recovery mode. I was pretty much bedbound. I was tired all the time. I slept all the time, struggled to walk up the stairs, ended up revisiting the hospital almost every day for different things going on. And it was honestly one of the toughest times I think I've been through. All of the things that I was used to doing, like being in a job, in a sales job, being an elder in the church in Leeds there, preaching regularly and leading meetings, even looking after my daughter who was 9 months old at the time, and being any sort of husband was quite difficult. And I realized, going through that period, how much of my identity was in the things that I do, how much value I had taken from man's praise. And we can very quickly become quite insecure. We can quickly lose what we think is our confidence. And I'm aware this is quite a unique experience. Not all of you will have experienced something like that, but I want to say all of you will experience going through life with either in our friendships or our relationships or our careers, and you will feel at some point overlooked or undervalued. It's going to happen. As a mum, you might feel it. As a dad, whatever that is. And for many of us, when we feel this way, there are some things that we start to do. We start to withdraw. And we can end up not only withdrawn from those around us, but we can start to withdraw from our relationship with God. We tend to stop stepping out in new things as well. We tend to stop taking risks in the kingdom. And we run the risk, actually, of becoming bitter and angry with whoever we blame for the circumstances of what we're in. But Daniel here, in chapter 5, has been dropped to becoming a nobody for however many years, we don't quite know. But he was ready. He was ready for action. His identity was obviously not in the upfront praise of man, but it was totally in his relationship with God. He didn't show any anger or bitterness towards Belshazzar. He didn't say, I'm not interpreting this one for you. You don't know who I am. He was ready for action. He hadn't slipped into retirement mode. He hadn't become despondent. He doesn't need to ask Belshazzar for time alone with God to interpret the writing on the wall. There's no hurry. Can I just go and do some fasting and pleading with God here? He's ready for action. 20 or 30 years, he's been dropped. Even in the lows of life, when he's been dropped, he knew God had not dropped him. And he knew God was delighted to use him in his perfect timing. And knowing who we serve on this planet helps us to keep the right perspective in the tough times. Do you know, recognition by man, it can be highly flattering. But I want to say and encourage us, we live our lives not seeking man's flattery, but seeking to serve the King of Kings whenever he calls. Okay? That's the first point. Second point, Daniel was not interested in man's riches. He knew the writing was on the wall for Belshazzar. That verse 17 says, Then Daniel answered the king, You may keep your gifts for yourself and give your rewards to someone else. Nevertheless, I will read the writing for the king and tell him what it means. Do you know the world that we're in, the world's idols are still the same as they were back there. There's no different. Money, power, fame, sex. Those are the idols of the world today. And these are the things that the world wants to tell you to give all your time and attention to. These are the things that really count in life. These are the things that are going to make you happy. But we know just from looking at the stats out there, in our own culture, we have more loneliness, more depression, more anxiety than ever before. At the same time, we probably have more money, more fame than ever before due to the technology and the worldwide reach that we have. And I was thinking about this situation here as these wise men, these astrologers are asked to interpret the writing. It's not quite like the dream, where they can't see anything and they don't quite know. They've got to tell the king what his dream is. This is a little bit easier. And my thought as I was reading this was, why didn't they just make something up, you know? Okay, I'm going to tell you what this writing means, and go for it. But I think, honestly, and obviously to get this power and this fame and to become the third highest ruler in the kingdom, but the gravity of the situation here is something I think we struggle to understand. Okay, the king has literally turned pale seeing this hand writing on the wall. It says he's shaking with fear as this hand appears on the wall. This is serious. And if you've been present to see this, I don't think anyone wants to make a guess or just make something up. But you see, Daniel knows he can interpret this writing. Why? Because he knows the author. And what he does is just so counterculture. To reject wealth and power when we live in a world that craves it and chases after it is crazy. You know, in our workplaces, in our friendships, there are going to be things offered that are attractive. And I'm not saying here that we're to turn down all the things that are offered. You know, there are going to be promotions and opportunities that come our way that absolutely we grab hold of. But I am saying that having the discernment and the integrity to turn things down in our culture is difficult. So why and how did Daniel turn down this offer of wealth and power down? Firstly, I want to say he's clearly experienced great fame and honor after the dream that he interpreted. And I think he actually knows how fickle and fleeting man's power and fame is. He also knew what the writing meant. He knew that Belshazzar's time was up. It was going to end the very next day. But more than these practical reasons that you can sort of surmise, he knew he was destined for a much greater kingdom than the Babylonian kingdom. He truly held an eternal perspective. His eyes were fixed on a kingdom that would never perish, spoil, or fade. And that meant that all the shiny things that were being offered didn't captivate his gaze. Secondly, he knew who he was serving ultimately. He wasn't serving a fickle king who was here today and literally gone tomorrow. But he was serving the King of Kings, the one who always has been and always will be. And he knew also that this gift that he'd been given, this gift of interpretation, had been given by God. And it wasn't to be used for his personal gain, but it was for glorifying and pointing people to his kingdom. He knew that his rewards in eternity would be far greater and wouldn't just last for a day, but would last for an eternity. I just want to say, folks, we need to be asking for the discernment to take hold of the things that God has for us, whilst having the courage to say no to the things that our spirit is saying no to. And I just want to say the way we do this is by cultivating that eternal perspective of who we are and who we're serving. Okay, final point. I was going to speak about truth being spoken, but Chris spoke so well on this last week. What you have here again is Daniel speaking truth to the point where he could get killed, you know? The fear that would have came as he spoke this truth about the king. Your kingdom is going to come to an end tomorrow. Most kings would have just chopped off his head. But Chris spoke so well about speaking truth alongside love last week. If you haven't heard it, please do go and listen to it. It was excellent. So I just want to touch on two things. Just to say this party that is being thrown is important because we know historically what was going on at the time. We know the Medes were attacking. They'd already taken, they think, a few weeks earlier, a Babylonian outpost or an army just 50 miles away from Babylon. And there is a good chance right here on this night that Belshazzar knew the Medes were literally just outside the city of Babylon here. But this city, Babylon, was a superpower. It had been built with hugely thick walls. Some historians suggest the walls were literally 25 meters thick and several times higher than the Great Wall of China. It had a huge river, the Euphrates, running right through it. It had lots of land inside of it where they could grow crops and rear livestock. They were totally self-sufficient. And in those days, one of the ways that an army would conquer is to sit on the outsides of the wall and starve out the city. They would cut off the water supplies, they would let no one out, and they would wait for surrender. But Babylon was so self-assured. They thought, with these huge walls, that they were impenetrable. So throwing a feast while you're about to be attacked is the absolute height of arrogance. Okay? We saw last week that the root of pride for Nebuchadnezzar was not acknowledging that Yahweh is the one who deserves all the glory, and it is he that gives us all that we have. And we saw, didn't we, Nebuchadnezzar being given a chance, a grace period of 12 months to acknowledge Yahweh. And we see him standing on the roof, and he utters the words, "Look at this amazing city that I have built." And bang, God acts. We get God humbling him, bringing him low so that he ends up becoming like a beast of the field and he loses his mind until he eventually realizes and acknowledges Yahweh. And here we see another king, only 20 to 30 years after. He's not learnt from Nebuchadnezzar. He's arrogant, okay? And he's mocking Yahweh. And he brings out these goblets that are from his place of worship. And he uses them to indulge in drunkenness while worshiping their own gods. Not only is this king not acknowledging Yahweh, he's actually outright mocking Yahweh and what he's doing. And Daniel says in verse 23, "But you did not honor the God who holds in his hand your life and all your ways. Therefore, he sent the hand that wrote the inscription." And then we have that inscription there. I just want to say God is a God of absolute grace, and he shows immense patience. And we see it, it's not just a New Testament thing, it's an Old Testament thing. He's a God of grace throughout Scripture. And even what he does there in Nebuchadnezzar is gives him a grace period. But when he decides to act, he will. And you know what? It's all too easy to look at Belshazzar in this passage and see the failures. But I feel this is an area that we have to continually examine in our own hearts. Have we grown proud of our achievements? Do we acknowledge God as the one who is not just over all things, but who is the author of our own lives? Do we recognize everything that has been given by him? And doing that means not only if we feel we have plenty, but it means acknowledging him and recognizing what he's given us when we don't feel we have plenty. Again, Daniel's become a nobody, but he's not bitter, he's not resentful. He continues to honor God in the good times and the bad. And you know, that is so much easier said than done. But I want to urge us all, let's keep checking our hearts when it comes to pride. And secondly, and finally, I just want to say God is a giant slayer, okay? I want to ask you, who are your spiritual Babylons in our lives? Because God is a God of the impossibles. God said on the inscription that the king would fall that very night. And when God says it, it happens. And he did. You see, what happened, they think in this battle, is the Medes saw this huge river running through the giant walls of the city. And they decided to make a dam and stop it running through the city. And once they stopped the water, they realized there was a gap in the riverbed under these huge walls. And this army just walked their way through this impenetrable city. Our God is a God of the impossible. So I just want to ask you, who is it in your life right now that you might be struggling with to have faith for today? It might be a difficult work colleague. It might be a family member. It might be a situation in your life that you just don't think can be changed or turned around. But we need to remember, just as Belshazzar was prophesied that he was found wanting on the scales and his kingdom was divided, this was where we were at as well. Before Jesus broke into our lives, we were weighed and we were found wanting. Our scale said sinner. And the penalty was death. We lived in a totally divided kingdom that said, worship this thing and look after self. But just as God said he would, he had a rescue plan. A rescue plan to break into our dark world and free it from the tyranny of death and sin. Just want to say there are no giants too big in our world for God to deal with. And this story here of how he dealt with Babylon the Great, should encourage us to expect more, to expect the impossible. Where we know in and of ourselves there is no answer. But in and of God, there is.